Hi everyone. So I recognize I have the afternoon time slot, which is like, if there's a worse thing than an afternoon keynote time slot, it's having an afternoon workshop time slot after an incredibly long day. So I hope not, what I'm not going to do for you is read a paper. And what I'm not going to do today is I'll address actually the topic of preaching because that's what happens, and so that's what it's on. So I'll do both of those things, and I hope to have a kind of conversation and leave plenty of room for dialogue. It's a bit unconventional, and I think the title in some sense was a lie, not a full lie, but I'll explain here in a moment how this came about. So I'm Tim O'Malley, I direct the Center for Liturgy, and I also teach in the Department of Theology. I did my undergrad and master's at Notre Dame, and then I did my doctoral work at Boston College on the preaching of Augustine. And that's how I've gotten into sort of preaching things, or I did partially the preaching of Augustine. And at Notre Dame, we have two theology requirements. Our first theology requirement is called Foundations of Theology, which is a very simple, easy course to cram everything in for. It's Old Testament, New Testament, and the first 600 years of the church. So, it's a slow, meditative reading of Leviticus primarily. That is not true. So it's a quick course, but we also have these courses at the second level called developmental courses. It takes a theme or idea from a first level course and does it historically from basically year 75 or 80 through today. And sometime early in my career here, I thought, well, I know Augustine's sermons, and I actually, when you do doctoral work, one of the things you do is you stop reading anything else besides your narrow little world. And so I was really looking forward to, I loved Augustine's sermons, but I wanted to dive deeper into sort of preaching historically and the art of preaching across beyond 420, which is where I was stuck. So I proposed a course that would introduce students to theology, but the only thing that we would read would be sermons. That was the shtick. And I gave it a fancy title because if you give something a boring title like reading sermons or theology of preaching, you'll have 0 people sign up for your course. Whereas if you call something like savoring the mystery, they're like, ooh, I don't know what that means, but I want it. Right, yeah, a cheeseburger. Oh, there's a microphone. All right, can people hear me without the microphone? Great, I don't like to use them in this room. So I want to just introduce you to the course. What you have is everything that I'm going to say broadly on here, in addition to the syllabus for the class. It's yours to take, destroy, to do whatever you want to. This course provides an introduction to Christian doctrine through special attention to the art of Christian preaching. Students will read sermons from throughout Christian history, including those by Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant preachers. So it's supposed to consider the fullness of sort of the ecumenical tradition of the church. The course will consider how Christians have undertaken the art of scriptural interpretation, the relationship between theology and spirituality, the role of the liturgical year in shaping Christian doctrine, and how Christians have interacted with major social and intellectual trends in communicating Christianity in a variety of contexts. Students in this course will thus be introduced to a theology of revelation, of preaching, of doctrine, of culture, and the contours of spiritual theology. That's sort of a course the course description that really piques the interest of 19-year-olds. Except it did. The first time I taught the course, because it was on preaching, it was supposed to have 40 students, and I ended up with a course at 67. The second time I taught the course, I said, I'm not teaching 67 students again. So I want to cap it at 50, and I had 59. There was, in this course, some deep kind of spiritual interest in preaching specifically that interested the students. And believe me, that wasn't why I taught the course per se. I mean, I had a sense that reading sermons would be nicer than reading De Trinitate by Augustine. I thought, well, they didn't enjoy that. But actually, what I realized is that in the midst of actually doing these readings, they actually were formed to understand what preaching is and to critique it. So, we had objectives. We wanted to focus on the person of Jesus Christ because I needed some theme to tie the sermons together. And I thought, well, Jesus, he's not bad. Become aware of the major theological figures and trends. Cultivate the capacity to read sophisticated texts through attentive reading of Christian sermons. Ideally, you would like to have Bernard of Clairvaux before you, but he's very dead, although a saint, but dead. So you don't have him, so you have to have texts. And perceive the relationship between theology and lived practice. And it was here that I was most shocked. I found that there ended up being an implicit goal of the course. I began to have students, so one of the assignments of the course was for the students to write a sermon in the style of one of the authors they read, and then to give it through audio recording. That was fun. But one other extra credit assignment was that they were invited to critique a sermon they heard on campus. I had students who told me, I was shocked. Okay, so this is everything you think you know about undergraduates or young people, put it away. They were shocked that the sermons didn't actually preach on the scriptures. Again and again they said to me, I just heard yet another homily about this movie or this this recent vacation of this presbyter, and I haven't heard the scriptures. They noted that pious platitude was what was talked about, that nothing historical or social was ever brought up in the context of the sermon. Nothing existential seemed to be drawn from. Now, there are others who loved it. But often, I found one of the things our students loved the most, and this is where I realized that there needed to be a sort of education of taste, is when students loved preaching sometimes, it was because it was fun. So they liked it because it was funny and entertaining. Oh, listen, I love funny and entertaining things. Jim Gaffigan, to me, I would mostly prefer to listen to him than a sermon. If you know who Jim Gaffigan is, then that's great. If you don't, you should reorient your life. But the fact is that there was sort of two reactions. The preaching is not great, or I really like when it's funny. And so the two sort of modes were that there's almost like a lack of taste for even the art of preaching. What does it look like? What does it sound like? And I had them make suggestions, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that at some point in time. But what I'd like to do today is engage in a little bit of a thought experiment with you. I'm not going to talk about that course anymore, really. The course was fun. But what I want to do is offer a kind of reflection of what I learned from teaching this course now twice. Both times highly successful classes, receiving in the upper division of our student evaluations, not simply because of me, because of the material. What is the sense of the faithful and how is it related to preaching? The insight that I came to is that actually if you're going to attend to preaching to the baptized, I sort of suggested this yesterday, you might want to actually talk to the baptized or see what they want in preaching. This is crazy, but seems necessary. And to form yet the baptized in the art of this preaching. What does good preaching sound like? How does something like philosophical aesthetics or the study of beauty reveal something about how to form the taste of the faithful to both listen fruitfully to preaching and to offer criticism of said preaching? I think that there's some sort of aesthetic formation needed for our undergraduates so that they can actually better articulate to those charged with the office of preaching what they need to hear. What are the general principles that one can use to form undergraduates in appreciating preaching? I'll suggest some of these and use some of the text that we read. And what implications are there relative to catechetical and theological education and priestly formation? and probably other implications which I'm fine for you to throw out at any point in time. Does that sound good? Good, because I really didn't have anything else, so we just left, so this is better. Let me begin with an account of the sense of the faithful. Actually, the Catholic Theological Society of America, which is the professors of Catholic theology in America, it's a very creative title, met recently on the topic of the sense of the faithful. And one of the documents that was released by the International Theological Commission in 2014 was the notion of the sense of the faithful. What do I mean by sense of the faithful? Sense of the faithful is actually a novel term introduced formally into ecclesial teaching at the Second Vatican Council. That there is amongst the faithful this sense of what is congruent and true and beautiful in Christianity, and it dwells in the faithful in such a way that the Spirit guides the faithful along. So the first person to really raise this principle to a high level was John Henry Newman, who noted that in his own sort of, in the time of the 4th century, for example, it was the faithful who maintained Christ's identity as divine, fully divine, consubstantial with the Father, whereas theologians, it was more up for grabs, but that there was a sense of the faithful in which the activity of this prayer dwelt. And so the faithful, this document says, have an instinct for the truth of the gospel, which enables them to recognize and endorse authentic Christian doctrine and practice, and to reject what is false. That supernatural instinct linked to the gift of faith received in the communion of the church is called the sensus fidei, the sense of the faithful. And it enables Christians to fulfill their prophetic calling. In his first Angelus address, Pope Francis quoted the words of a humble elderly woman he once met. If the Lord did not forgive everything, the world would not exist. And he commented with admiration, that is the wisdom which the Holy Spirit gives. The woman's insight is a striking manifestation of the sense of the faithful, which, as well as enabling a certain discernment with regard to the things of faith, fosters true wisdom and gives rise, as here, to proclamation of the truth. It is clear, therefore, that the sense of the faithful is a vital resource for the new evangelization to which the church is strongly committed in our time. That the baptized, and it's always a risk if you're one of those who are ordained to talk about the baptized as some creature that is not you. Sort of the way I often hear millennials talk about. Millennials are like millennials. Ugh. Oh, they're like so young and annoying, and they use Twitter. That actually, it's the heart of the gospel that dwells with the baptized. That the word preached already dwells in the life of the church, even before your activity of proclamation. It dwells there. And your activity of proclamation is essential to its continuing and its infusion and its transformation. But as I always say, like, I will proclaim that, if I don't have anyone to preach, or I don't like their homily, the sense of the faithful dwells in my domestic church with my family. The gospel dwells there. The preaching will dwell there. Which is unfortunate for my son. And the baptized have this particular sense of the faithful, the laity, insofar as they exist in the world and test out in some ways they test out the gospel that's preached. That the Second Vatican Council made clear that the distinction between an ecclesia docens, a teaching church, and an ecclesia discens, the learning church, are not distinct, that it's one church. I think that this is the theme of the conference. I think this is actually what it is. That it's not the preacher who's saying to the baptized, you don't know anything, here it is. Though there are occasions, right, where one doesn't know something. And yet, the learning church can't actually exist without this activity of teaching. It's mutual. That's how the sense of faithful is formed. And here's the text that draws the main insight for this work we're doing. So there is the sense of the faithful understood as the infallible nature of the church as a whole. That infallibility is the Pope's office in certain situations, but it's also fundamentally the church's office. That the Spirit makes sure that the church does not go awry. Which may seem shocking, and you need to take the long view. But that actually infallibility dwells first in the church. But it also dwells in the believer. And that's the sense of the faithful ones. The sense of the faith of the faithful ones. The sensus fidei fidelis. Also enables individual believers to perceive any disharmony, inherent or contradiction between a teaching or practice and the authentic Christian faith by which they live. They react as a music lover does to false notes in the performance of a piece of music. Note that image. Have you ever listened to the bells on campus for the Angelus? If you listen to them, they ring at noon, they ring at tonight at 6. They also conclude at 9. And it plays the alma mater of this place, which with our bells end up sounding like da, 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 da. And it's painful to listen to. You know that there's something incoherent and out of order and misshapen, and the performance is actually offensive, right? They react as a music lover does to false notes in the performance of a piece of music. In such cases, believers interiorly resist the teachings or practices concerned and do not accept them or participate in them. The habitus, or the virtue, that's from Aquinas. The habitus of faith possesses a capacity whereby, thanks to it, the believer is prevented from giving assent to what is contrary for the faith, just as chastity gives protection with regard to whatever is contrary to chastity. In some ways, there is a crisis in preaching. And it's not a unique crisis. You know the roots better than I do. You yourselves were trained or not trained in preaching to certain degrees. But it is the sense, and I think it's an actual sense, that what is being preached is not perceived amongst the faithful as the life-giving text of the gospel. And that, I think as Archbishop Tobin noted, most people continue to go to church because of the life of the Eucharist, and they put up with the preaching. Which is fine. Like I said, it's better that anyone's there. And I go for the Eucharist, and in the homily, give or take it, it's fine, it's 8 minutes, and I have a son, so if it's really atrocious, I can always take him back. But the presumption in the present life of the church that that is going to get us by in the future, that this sort of Eucharistic depth and spirituality exists, that will sustain believers moving into the future, that should be assumed to be gone. And that often the first encounter with the church is going to be liturgical, but it's also going to be the act of preaching. At funerals, at baptisms, at the weddings that still happen, that these activities, and the fact that people don't hear something worthy to listen to, needs to be retuned. Yet at the same time, I don't want to say this, that the expectation for perpetual entertainment does sort of harm this sense, right? Like, I know what it's like as a teacher to walk into a classroom and feel like, oh no. First of all, I'm underprepared. Deeply, deeply underprepared because I have a child and he decided to wake up at 2 a.m. and hate me. And I had no time to do this, and a meeting came up, and I had to do this email, and I had to do this, and now we're 45 minutes before class starts, and what am I going to do? So to what extent can the faithful themselves be formed to expect something different in preaching so that there's a kind of mutual love that's exchanged in the act of preaching in which we do give each other the benefit of the doubt? You give everything you have, and I give everything I have as the listener. Okay. Any thoughts about that? Or questions, interruptions? I hated it. Whatever you'd like to say is fine. Do you get a sense in your own preaching that it seems to disconnect? Yeah, did you raise your hand?
I started to.
Great.
Well, it wasn't to what you just asked, Timothy.
That's fine.
So the crisis of catechesis in the church today, how does that affect the sense of the faithful and their imbued, and this notion, which I really love the notion, and I, in many respects, experience it to be the case in parishes I've served. But by the same token, there's a whole big crowd of folks coming who are either almost completely uncatechized or unbelievably woefully under-catechized.
I totally agree, and that's why your preaching really matters. For a lot of people, that's going to be their primary encounter with anything in the life of the church. It's just the way around it. Sure, we would love to get them into small discipleship groups. We would love to get them involved in parish life and sort of involved in furthering adult faith formation. And the goal is to get them there, believe me, the goal is to get them there. There has to be a whole sort of parish and pastoral renewal from the ground up. But that's why preaching is so important. That's why a well-given homily opens up the imagination to perceive that what is given in Christ in the church is actually the most wonderful thing for the rest of your life possible. And that's why then suddenly, once you hear that, then you start to give yourself a little over to catechesis. I'm not specifically talking about the course here, but my students are terribly catechized. They don't know what a sacrament is. A student from another course once asked if, so a sacrament, right? The Bible is a sacrament. Okay, so actually, he may have been onto something, but I don't think he meant it, I don't think he meant that. My students have never read the scriptures. They have never, they know their favorite first paper mistake is when they're writing about Jesus, to say Jesus and also God, and they have no grammar, but they encounter something that's attractive and persuasive. They want the grammar. Like in the same way, I hate learning languages. I hate to sit down and learn French, like the subjunctive tense. I love learning languages when I'm in Italy trying to order wine. I think the same thing is at work, where the reason, you can't start sometimes with the grammar as much as I want. You have to start with the wine. With the Italian, you need to speak Italian if you want to order wine. Or not just wine, but other things. And that sort of opens you up to the grammar. So I do think it's related. I just think that's the precise sort of reality at hand.
So as you go into the classroom, partially prepared or whatever, and you know that the audience is going to be not very receptive, even if you write your best, and you relate that to us preaching to a congregation who's expecting entertainment, if they're expecting anything at all, or watching their watch so that they can get out of there quickly and all of that. Where do we go with that? How do we deal with that?
I do want to get there, yes.
Okay.
So I think there are things that you can do, but I will say, my students, even when I'm slightly underprepared, the class experience isn't miserable. Because I know what I need to do in those situations where I'm a little bit underprepared in order to do what I need to do. In other words, ideally, I would have perfection. Sometimes I walk out and say, that's a B+, we're going to go. Or, well, we're at Notre Dame, so grade inflation is massive, so a B+ is probably more like a C-. But there's things you can do. I always feel, okay, this is me too, because I am tempted to blame it too. The worst thing that one can do is to blame your audience for not getting what you said. And I'm tempted to do it too, because I'm a teacher, and I grade these essays, and I'm like, well, what, did you read anything that in the class? And obviously you are a failure. And then I have to ask, well, who is the teacher? It is me. Oh no. Maybe it's my fault that all of them misunderstood grace. So there is this kind of mutual love. I want to move on, but we'll get, because I want to make sure we have plenty of dialogue at the end. So what I want to talk about then is formation into aesthetics. Aesthetics is the science of perception, or it's used more with beauty, how you're formed with beauty. And this is the Baldacchino at St. Peter's. And I wanted to ask you, do you think it's beautiful?
Yes.
Yes, why?
Color, symmetry, shape, variety of patterns.
Good. So color, symmetry, variety. Do other people think it's beautiful? Do you have a reason?
Yes, just because of the art that's around it.
Oh, so where it is. Great. What else?
No,
Okay, it's old. Are all old things beautiful? I mean, I hope so.
It's got a history.
It's got a history. Okay. It has a tradition. How many people don't like it? Why don't you like it?
It doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't inspire a feeling, there's no emotion.
Okay, so you have no emotional effect to it. Okay, good. What else?
It's like just too much.
What is too much about it?
Everything. It's like there's too many different shapes, too many competing areas of focus. It's like a bunch of food you threw up on person.
Great. So let me articulate that in a formal sort of mode. What you're critiquing is Baroque architecture.
Yeah.
And you're
I'm not
critiquing that what you have is Baroque architecture is basically ecclesial vomit.
Yeah. It's like gild that lily.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, that's good. Other people? Yeah.
I find it clunky in an otherwise lofty environment.
Clunky and a lofty environment. Good. Now, of course, one of the problems we have is we're looking at a picture of it and we're not looking at it. So if you're there, it feels.
I found it that way in person.
Okay, good. All right. So great. So I'll call for this. Others? Yeah.
My idea of beauty is much more natural and more outdoors, and I'm just not into buildings. And, you know, walking into a building, perhaps the picture of a building really doesn't do anything for me. Whereas if you had a forest and some sunlight coming through it, that evokes an experience in me. Whereas this, you know, sort of does, but sort of doesn't.
Okay, so your assumption is that what constitutes authentic beauty is natural, and this is in some ways a non-natural form of beauty.
Or I'm not there.
You're not there. If you were there, it would be different. But
I might evoke something in me, but.
great. So the subject matters in the context of the beauty. Yeah. What are you gonna say?
On the other hand, I can recognize that something is beautiful even if it's not
Say that.
the favorite place I'd want to be.
Exactly. So okay. So something is beautiful even if you think it's not.
Yeah, I can, well, it's not that, even if I think it's not, but it's that it may not be to my liking.
Right.
It may not be the place I want to hang out all the time, but I can still recognize that, okay, this is objectively beautiful.
Right.
But it's not my thing.
Good. One more comment, but I want to go back to that one because I think that's the heart of the teaching people aesthetic criticism.
well, just two things. Modern sensibilities, it's recycled, so that's kind of cool in the modern day.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is, it's massive, which it must be because of the space it's sitting in.
Yeah, so there's proportionality of space, what architects call fittingness. If you look at Notre Dame Stadium right now and that monstrosity we're building on the sides of it, it lacks fittingness. It's actually ruining the fittingness of campus as a whole. I would argue, no one has listened. But what I want to return back to is this notion that there's something objective about what constitutes beauty, and that even if you as the subject don't like it, you can make an objective argument of what constitutes the beauty or not beauty of it. And if we don't actually begin here, there's all sorts of problems that introduce into preaching, which is there is no such thing as good preaching or bad preaching, beautiful preaching or ugly preaching. It just depends on what you want. That's a radical subjectivity. That means that we can't actually communicate. If the only thing that we can say on the other side is, you're right and I'm right, then we've lost it, right? Like, we can't have a conversation. Not to mention that we actually do argue over spaces. Publicly, right? Like, think about a city. Cities have all sorts of arguments about architecture. That's what makes it sort of, there is a sense of like what constitutes. It's a reasonable and rational endeavor. But you have to learn it, right? Like, Regina, the way that you were talking about form and symmetry is the sort of thing that helps you be formed to look anew at something, because you say, like, oh, you're actually right, that's fitting. Or, like, you have to be formed in the other sorts of art. Like, I didn't show you another one, but what if I showed you a terrible baldacchino? That's the thing about the altar. Like, made from candy canes or something like that, like Santa's Village. You might have a total different reaction. That we have to be formed to perceive it. Yes?
Just a very quick question. Isn't the you're right and I'm right thing where the millennials are?
Yeah, but so were you. Any blaming of millennials for any attitudes they have, millennials always got their attitudes from the generation that came before, and the generation that came from before. So this sort of turn to the subject, while perhaps radical in millennials, is learned, as Christian Smith makes clear, from the generation that preceded them. So I always think when we blame millennials, the problem is we forgot about their parents. And we forgot about their parents' parents, and that's why the church has this beautiful gift called original sin, which is actually says that like this thing isn't your fault or the generation's fault before it, but it's like mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. So in this way, I actually think, yes, millennials are there. My students, for example, when I teach this course, I'll often ask them existential questions, like when we read Gregory of Nyssa's homilies on the Beatitudes, or John Chrysostom's homilies on the poor. I've said to them, do you have an obligation to care for the poor? And they'll say, no. Why? Well, because an obligation is only dependent on the system you have. And inevitably one of the students will say something like, well, if, Hitler wasn't really wrong either, because in his system, everything made sense. And actually, in that exercise, which I always do, they end up suddenly realizing the absurdity of what they've just said, and come back to some degree of like, well, there has to be some sort of thing to argue over. So yes, I think millennials are there, but I actually think it's not just millennials, I think it's the generation before. And I think we do have to retrieve it. That's why I teach. Because I want to retrieve it. I want to get them to have arguments that matter. And realize that some arguments do matter. So it's a great question. But I don't think they want it. I don't think they want to stay there just because it's an absurd way of living your life. So this is an analogy, though, to the kind of work that I do in this course, and I think that needs to be done amongst what we call this sense of the faithful, or I'm going to call the taste of the faithful. And what is aesthetic taste? Well, Roger Scruton, who's a philosophical writer on aesthetics, notes when we study buildings, our attitude is not simply one of curiosity, accompanied by some indefinable pleasure or dissatisfaction. Inwardly, we affirm our preference as valid, and if we did not do so, it's hard to see how we might be seriously guided by it, how we might rely on it to fill in the gaps left by functional reflections in the operation of practical knowledge. That is, if you're talking to someone about something that's beautiful, you're going to argue about it and have preferences that matter. So, the very same homily that you thought was remarkable, someone will say is terrible. But it's not good enough to say, like, well, I didn't like it. Well, what didn't you like? What are the assumptions that are undergirding? What did you not like? Our preference means something more to us than mere pleasure or satisfaction. It is the outcome of thought and education. It is expressive of moral, religious, and political feelings of an entire worldview with which our identity is mingled. We are educated to perceive beauty. When I was in art history class in high school, my teacher forced us to look at image after image of Degas' ballerinas. I was a 15-year-old boy who was predisposed to find every image of a ballerina ugly. Ballerinas are silly. Why would you paint a ballerina? It's a stupid thing to paint a ballerina, and why would you paint a ballerina more than once? That seems excessive. But our teacher forced us to look at image after image of the body, and the way that it's formed and moves, and the subtle ways that Degas uses light to illuminate the sort of pain and suffering of the activity of dance. And suddenly, I found ballerinas beautiful. Education forms this taste. We call it taste. And our tastes are formed as we grow up. They grow and they ideally get more sophisticated. My son is addicted to Elmo right now. I hope when he's 45 that that's not his prime form of art. I hope he gets to watch film that's excellent, and I hope he gets to read books that he likes and not Sandra Boyden's Good Night, or all the sort of children's books he reads. Taste is formed, and the kind of taste we're formed in matters, and that's why, to me, introducing students to excellent sermons forms their taste. I'll get back to it. In addition to forming their taste, one of the reasons I think introducing students to excellent sermons is important is because classic works of art mean something, and it meant something for many generations. Like, how many of you think that your sermons will be collected when you die and published? Now, there's probably a reason. And I know that most of what I've ever written throughout my life will disappear. But there are things that stand out, that actually seem to matter, that capture something that is classic, that reveals some sort of meaning to us about what it means to pray. So I'm not going to read that quote, but that's what that quote says. That there's this meaning that comes to us in these art forms that matter. The first time I am addicted to Mozart's Symphony No. 41, the Jupiter Symphony. I think it is the greatest piece of music that has been composed. And others do too. But every time I listen to it, like good music, every time you listen to it, it's not like, okay, so this is boring now. Like, I see Mozart, what you're doing, isn't that playful? You're taken back up into it. And this is what these great sermons do. These great traditions of preaching that we have enshrined in the life of the church, that have been hung on to, that people publish. Lastly, and the reason why I think sermons are very, very essential, and using authentic sermons are essential, is because it reveals something. Great sermons were crafted to be beautiful. Theology's authentic form radiates precisely from this equilibrium between the personal effort to acquire the understanding of faith, the intellectus fidei, and the participation bestowed as gift in the object of faith within one's life's experience. Indeed, as radiant form, the authentic form of theology is the fruit of precisely this union. This is one of my favorite lines. A non-existential theology, therefore, remains unworthy of belief because it is not capable of making anything really visible. Theology is meant to matter. And sermons, these classic sermons, work because they actually are theological thought that matters, often using some of the most simple words that you can imagine. Augustine, as I always tell my students, made in a number of sermons fart jokes. This was not because he was a dirty man. It's because he was willing to empty himself for the same man that wrote one of the most complex works of Trinitarian theology was not afraid to make a fart joke. This is more than like a duplicity of character. This means that he actually knew what it meant to love, to live this theology, and these sermons are kind of a lived theology. They show you that preaching matters, that preaching is this place where you think about things, but you also live it out and try to figure out what it means. Does that make sense? And that's what makes these sermons beautiful to the students. In addition to their form, right? They're crafted. Yes?
I agree with that, except I would want to say that I would want to preach a homily. I don't try to compare beautiful homilies. I try to compare homilies that are effective, functional, or whatever. And every once in a while, one of them hopefully rises to the level of beauty. But I don't think beauty is the goal. I wouldn't want to say that. I think it's...
What's function then? What does it mean when it works?
I would have to define that in the preparation of the homily.
Yeah, but wouldn't beauty be one of the things that one could do, like one of one's goals in the activity of preaching, even if you have another goal as well?
Yeah, but where I think that falls apart is then the priorities get out of whack. So I don't want to be a great preacher. I want to be a good preacher on a consistent basis, working at. I prefer the model of craft versus art.
Well, there are a lot of people today in philosophical aesthetics that talk about craft as a form of art. So I actually wouldn't radically separate those two things. I'm not saying that the goal is to create something that's going to be published 45 years later. I do think the using of beautiful turns of phrase is not a bad idea in preaching. That captures the imagination. Of course, the goal isn't to create an artwork in the same way that like Mozart's writing a symphony. Regina.
Possibly is like a meal. You want to prepare a meal. If I prepare it with my family, prepare pasta, I could serve it on the table in a pan, and I get some food on the table. But if I put it in a nice dish, then they're more inclined to want to gather around, and might be more inclined to linger longer. They might be more inclined to eat it
Right.
and enjoy it because it's in a pretty dish.
Exactly.
Not in the-
Well said. Yeah, that's what I mean. I certainly don't mean to say like the goal should be creating high art. Preaching is not high art. It can be, it has been, but that's not the goal. But to say that some part of it is to be something beautiful is not to say that.
It's not functional.
Right. There's lots of things that I find beautiful that are highly functional, including churches and other things. But I do agree it's a risk if you think that your goal is to be some sort of beautiful oration. Like, the preacher is never the gift to the congregation. It's never simply your words. And poor words can often affect the heart as well as beautiful words. I mean, I'm well aware of that fact. The mysteries of the human heart are the thing that I think my throwaway line in class is often the one that seems to matter the most to the students.
Quite often it seems to me that elements of beauty are a certain amount of dignity and reverence. I'm not talking about stuffiness.
Sure.
I'm talking about dignity and reverence that we human beings have it. It seems to me that beauty, like truth, like goodness, like oneness, is an attribute of God. And that if we can have things like beauty and truth and oneness in what we say, that is going to be inclined to make our homilies valid and worthwhile.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, so I'm a liturgical theologian by root, and I think your preaching act should be an activity of worship. It's addressed to the assembly, but it's also addressed to God. And I think if most preachers recognize that they're preaching, that their words are also directed to God, it would be a much more terrifying activity. It is an act of worship. The act of preaching is always an act of worship. Yeah.
I think we also have to be aware that what each individual hears is unique. I mean, we say it once, we know what it is that we have written, but I think we have all had the experience of somebody coming out after a homily and saying, hey, I love your part about so-and-so. It was never uncommon. And yet somehow they were able to hear them.
That's right.
So I don't know if that's part of their rising above the form, but.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, great works of art meaning come about. I mean, my students are always teaching me things that I didn't see in the text, that I didn't even think was there. They teach me, they hear it, and they heard your words. They heard something deeper in your words than you meant. That's like what an act of love that is. Also, it's an incredibly great act of it makes you feel good a little, because it means that like you actually did know what you were doing. Yeah.
Andre Resner is a preaching professor in South Carolina. He's a Presbyterian. And he has an entire course that does exactly what you're doing. Before his seminarians are ever allowed to take a preaching course, they all have to study the preaching so that they have some sense. I'll have to put you in touch with him. Have some sense of what effective preaching is. One of the standard, probably each person who's been taught in this room, there's the standard is what's the form of this homily and what's the function of this homily. And the function may be to lead people into beauty with the preacher as icon, but it also may also be some other function as in forgiveness or in forgiveness of course itself is beautiful.
Right.
As he was saying the truth, but to unpack the scriptures and look at it as to what is the function of what I'm going to say in the lives of the people. And so when you're done preaching, I work in coaching preachers, and I don't want people to say, man, are you a good preacher? Wow, Father, you're good. I want people to say, God is good.
Sure.
So again, that image of preacher as icon, look through me as a window and lead me to God. And so it's a high calling in terms of what is the function of this.
So beautifully said. Thank you. Well, I want to conclude with this, or move on to the next part, which is just introducing some of the things that my students from the sermons found worthwhile. Like the kind of things that they thought were important in preaching in general, and why they're attracted to the sermons they are. I have some examples. We're not going to go through all of them because that would be highly boring. But we'll look at some of them. And then at that point, I just want to offer a couple of implications and then open it up to sort of general conversation around the topic. So one of the things that my students appreciate is, one, the sermons that we read seem to introduce the listener into some sort of drama that's taking place. Something matters. There's something at stake. That there's, like, something could go incredibly wrong. One of my favorite preachers of my lifetime did this better than anyone else I know. It was this old crotchety priest from Massachusetts, who was so, he had reached a point of crotchety that was no longer crotchety, but like itself beautiful. He had become a character in a story of some sort of old priest, and he was like a brilliant preacher. And he always made you in the act of preaching. His homilies never lasted more than 9 minutes, 8 minutes. But he always made you feel like what he was saying relative to the gospel was a life or death matter. That what was being revealed mattered. And he didn't do it by emotional manipulation, but just like he actually believed it. And there's something about these texts I'll show you that captured my students most of all, that really get them into this drama, that something is at stake. And you often have to show them that in the old text, by the way. students look at old texts and say, that's great, but the goal of the teacher is to say what's at stake. 2, they engage the entire person, including the intellect and the affect. They are beautiful, they matter, I always think this, so this is the danger when we say that when we preach, for example, to undergraduates, we have to use language they understand, which is right. But we can't start thinking that in this act of self-emptying love, the danger is that we start to actually pretend they don't have a brain. And my students found these sermons interesting because, now these are Notre Dame students, they're very highly educated, although theologically they have the theological education of not much. But they said oh, this person really treats this seriously. Or treating me seriously, intellectually, that these figures, Bernard, or Augustine, or John Henry Newman, or Karl Rahner, this is serious stuff. But always with the affect, too. Engaging the imagination through poetic image. Image is what captured them again and again and again and again. They pulled out quotes from the text. They savored the quotes. They loved the specific quotes. And I'll show you a couple of these in a moment. These images stuck with them. A profound image stuck with them and became Bernard of Clairvaux's notion of the Trinity as kiss from the Song of Songs. It stuck with them. And they deal with the concrete reality of history itself. They're always in a context, a time, and they actually are dealing with that time. And if there's anything, so I'm a millennial, which is why I'm somewhat defensive of millennials. If there's anything that I find tiresome in preaching, it's that I always feel like this sermon has nothing to do with literally today. It could be ripped out, thrown into 1940, and it would be the same thing. It doesn't deal with history, time, space, what it means to live the gospel here and now. And every one of those preachers did that. They were very direct, very open to referencing history and time. So I just want to look at a couple of these. We're not going to look at them all. One of my students' favorite assignments relative to the preaching assignment was to try to write a homily like Mileto of Sardis. So Mileto of Sardis was a bishop, a Syrian bishop, well, probably, and he wrote what is a homily for Passover, for Easter, that's either a homily or a Eucharistic prayer text. But it sounds like a homily too. And it is written in lyric form. And it's making an argument about who Jesus Christ is for this new group of Christians who are coming into existence, yet are living still in a milieu with those who are not Christian. They're trying to figure out an identity. Who is Jesus? To answer that question. And they love the poetics of the text. For he was born a son, and led as a lamb, and slaughtered as a sheep, and buried as a man, and rose from the dead as God, being God by his nature and a man. He is in all things. He is law in that he judges. He is in word in that he teaches. He is in grace in that he saves. He is in Father in that he begets. He is Son in that he is begotten. He is sheep in that he suffers. He is human in that he is buried. He is God in that he is raised up. They read the text. I ask them to notice these specific images and try to figure out what's being argued. But in the context of it, they actually come to a deeper appreciation of who Jesus Christ is. That the sermon is a sort of Christological sermon on the nature of Jesus. And the poetic images, rather than tell them everything. So this morning, I thought Zini Fox did a beautiful job saying to us that image matters, ritual matters. It's not just sort of. But this is the introduction of image to their life, of some sort of poetry that says that actually makes sense of the phrase that Jesus is consubstantial with the Father, even though they're not really talking about that yet. that it sort of gives word and shape to an identity of Christ who is God and human, and they come to see that whatever Jesus brought, see, for them, Jesus is kind of boring. They all went to Catholic schools, they have a cross up there in the room, they're like, oh, so that's a cross, that's really exceptional. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. They haven't yet returned to a place where they had to struggle with the fact that in history, this is the first time that people are encountering what it means to say the name Jesus. And that this sermon is doing that. And it attracts them, it woos them, because they say, like, well, Jesus then is more important than I thought. I thought he was just sort of like a good-natured dude. It was like the sort of hippie version. From when I took a New Testament class here, we watched the hippie version of the Jesus story, in addition to one of the scariest I've ever seen, which is Jesus of Nazareth. That's scary Jesus. This was hippie Jesus, which was like, blessed are the poor in spirit, man, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They see that Jesus matters, and this text matters to them. Another I'll turn to, so I have others, but we don't just do old texts, because if we just did old texts, they would get the idea that preaching is for old people, or for dead people. And so we do the sermons, actually, the last thing we do is we do the sermons of Karl Rahner and Joseph Ratzinger. And I was surprised, their favorite preacher to read of the semester is Joseph Ratzinger. They think he's the warmest preacher that they have ever heard. I was shocked, I know, I was shocked. I mean, I think he's very warm, I love his writings, but they actually thought he's the warmest preacher they've ever heard. That he actually dealt with the gospel in a way that the rest of, like, no one, they had never heard a sermon that dealt with death, really. And he actually did. We read Rahner. He's marked out definite ways of salvation for us because he himself, grace beyond all measures, willed to walk them. Because he himself willed to become human, caught like us in time and space and history from which, in truth, no human mind can extricate itself in this world. He himself was born under the Emperor Augustus, precisely in Nazareth, from which no good can come. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, imprisoned in the here and now, and the not then and not there of a real human being. Dear grace of a God who loves humanity, we do not need to seek God in his kingdom of infinity, where after all we would hopelessly lose our way as though in a trackless void. In fact, Christianity is so human and so historical that it is too human for many people, who think that the true religion must be inhuman, that it is not of the senses, non-historical, but the Word was made flesh. In this section, I unpack for them the turn to the historical Jesus. And I show them how scriptural exegesis historically can be used in preaching. So, for example, Rahner doesn't say, now let me tell you a couple things about people from Nazareth, which I recently read in a commentary. What Rahner says is, this is a fact, and I'm just going to introduce you to the idea that to be from Nazareth, would there be no good that could come from Nazareth? He takes it up to encounter the personal historical Christ. But that personal historical Christ was not separate from God. And they find this highly attractive. This is the history they want dealt with. So we read the Advent sermons and we read about death. All my students would love to read more and more sermons about death. They love sermons on death. That's probably terrible to say, but they don't feel that they get enough homilies on things like dying, suffering, or misery. They get a lot of sermons on happy families. Everything is going to work out okay, don't worry about it. They really want to hear about that God takes up human suffering, becomes one of them, and transforms what it means to be human. That attracts them. So this is just, I think, some of the implications from this mean that to improve preaching in the church, I think actually involves the preachers. But I think even before it involves the preachers, it has to involve an increased expectation from the part of the assembly. What is preaching? And that means, I think in catechesis and in religious education programs, we have to reintroduce students to language that is not necessarily these texts. Like, don't need to give a fourth grader Bronner. I would highly not recommend that. But to give them the kind of language that's inspired by this preaching so that they get used to it. Our religious education textbooks are not written as preaching. And they're not preaching, I get it. And maybe the textbook's not the greatest way. But to form catechists in this way of preaching too is essential. I think that the untalked about aspect of this conference thus far is how catechists and lay people need to be formed to preach in their duties as catechist and layperson and in the world. Nobody has mentioned it. But in the reality, I meet with more people than, in a course of a day, I meet with a lot of people. I don't need to do liturgical preaching. I don't want to do liturgical preaching. I'm very happy with my vocation as a layperson in the world. But it would be helpful to form some of our catechists in communicating faith through preaching. The more of that, I think, the better. And that means you have to introduce them to some of these old techniques. Not just new techniques. I love new preaching literature, but I'm a historian partially. And I think historically, there's a way in which you can introduce people to something that captures the imagination without turning it into like a necessary method right away. Which is, I think, is the genius idea of having them read sermons first before they throw in a method. Because then they just say, well, then now I just have to do the method and I'll be okay. I also think it needs something for formation of the preacher. I am just shocked that preaching formation at this point doesn't include necessarily within Catholicism an encounter with these classic texts. I'm shocked. I guess that's it. But since we've already talked about it, I'm just shocked. I'm shocked that it's not more dedicated to say that these are actually some of the classic ways that faith has been preached, and you should know it. It doesn't mean you should imitate it, because if you imitated it, you would be like a bad artist. Like you'd be like one of those places who go to that place where you do wine, or where you drink wine and paint a painting that everyone has always seen. The wine and canvas places. I don't know if you've seen them. That's not your goal. But to learn the language, the grammar, is what I think enables you to like move it, and then to like in your preaching classes, take up certain methods, but do them today. I would love to start a week-long seminar at Notre Dame that would do this every summer. So if anyone has money to do that, I would appreciate it. You don't, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Lastly, I do think that listening to the baptized, you actually have to listen to the baptized. And someone asked if I ever approached a priest after church and said, I didn't, like last night, like, did you ever offer critique after Mass? And the answer is no. Because to be frank, I find that to be an inappropriate place to offer critique of sermon. The priest is not in a position to hear it, has a million things on his mind, is the end of a long day, and when I'm a teacher, I don't like when people come up in the midst of because you have so much self-doubt. That someone comes up to you and says, you know what, that was pretty average. How is that to be received? The only way that that's to be received is, you know what's average? Your face. I mean, the only way to receive that at that time is anger. But there is no place to offer this sort of critique. And I know preaching circles were suggested, but I also think you just can't have lay people who are malformed then tell you how to preach. Otherwise you have a group of malformed human beings forcing everyone to listen to bad preaching. Democracy is not always better. I think there has to be mutual formation together of gathering around the scriptures and gathering around some of these classic texts and offering, what do you think? How do you think how does this text seem to interpret the Song of Songs? Should I preach on the Song of Songs? If I was to preach on the Song of Songs, what would I preach on? Nobody preaches on the Song of Songs. If it comes up, it's like, yet we have every preacher, used to have to write sermon cycles for the Song of Songs. I would love, as a married couple, to occasionally hear the Song of Songs referenced. Or the Psalms here. Do you know that they're Psalms? No, I'm just kidding. I never hear the Psalms preached upon. Yet that's the sort of language that my students resonate with. They like it when Augustine says, yeah, let's take on, oh God, you are my God, for you I long, for you. What does desire mean? Or they like it when Augustine actually takes on Psalm 137, happy are those who bash the heads of infants against rocks. They like that it's dealing with history and time and space and all the feelings they actually have. Like anger and misery and disappointment, and also joy. So this is the kind of thing I think communities gathering together, really discussing the scriptures, priest and layperson, deacon and layperson alike, discussing the scriptures, but with these interpretive aids at hand that help us open up the text and get also open our imagination to what preaching sounds like. And these sermons, they're not yet preaching. They're dead words. I would never recommend writing it down and reading one of these. I actually, if I was a preacher, I would never write anything down. But I am also good at speaking in groups of people, and I understand the fears as well. But I do think that there's a tremendous gift to learning this method, and my students found it, and it opened up their imagination to the gift of preaching within the church. And to be frank, it raised their expectations. So I won't teach the course too many more times so that you don't end up having people with too many raised expectations. But this course raised the expectations of my undergraduates to say, this is what I expect, and why am I not getting it? So I'm going to keep doing that just for a little while longer. Because I do think that it is a crisis within the life of the church, bad preaching. Not the worst thing. There are worse things. But it does harm. All right, so that's what I have. I would be interested in our remaining time together, which is apparently, we started, at 3:15? So in our remaining 7 minutes together, to spend just a moment, I'll be around at the rest of the conference too, but to spend a moment, why don't you just sort of write down one thing that you sort of think you're thinking about? It doesn't have to be deep, but one thing you're thinking about right now. And it could be that you want to kill me, but if it's not that, then one thing that's not bad. Right.
exception, and that you should teach this class more, so that it's gonna up the ante for those people who are currently preaching, because they know that the people in the pews have good expectations. And eventually, some of those people that have been formed as good hearers of preaching may become preachers themselves, and they will have been formed in an environment that's sustained by good preaching. Because I teach permanent deacon candidates in seminaries. I ask at the start of every class, how many of you entered diacon or priesthood formation because you wanted to be preachers? Absolute max would be 10%. They're almost embarrassed to raise their hands. And I think it's because, and if you would do this class 50 more times, that percentage hopefully would go up over time, because people would have been used to good preaching, seeing the value.
I hope so. My department chair speaks fifth in the keynote tomorrow, so feel free to walk up to him after this and offer that recommendation.
I would definitely echo what you said about forming lay people for preaching. Opportunities to preach are as common as grass, and I think if we continue to put all of our homiletic focus on Sunday preaching, most people will not hear the preached word. And I think lay people have unique opportunities to preach in a variety of settings, and I think help inform those lay voices for effective witness and evangelization can only be a good thing.
Yeah, it's beautifully said, and there's already going on. I participated in our high school youth ministry program this week as a speaker, which is one of my gifts of love that I do from back when I was good at speaking to high school students. And one of the things that already happens prevalent in youth ministry is itinerant preaching. I mean, it's the norm. They all sell their services at like the National Catholic Youth Conference, and they have no formation. They are just as likely to be bad preachers as, but they sometimes also play the spoons. That might be ridiculous, but they're actually the ones who play the spoons. Yeah, I think this formation is central. Yeah.
I really like your saying about the crisis about preaching today.
Yeah.
I would say there won't be crisis if I am able to connect to the heart of the people. Of course, we have the critique, the form, the aesthetics, everything. For example, as a student of theology, my professor asked us to critique a sermon, and we come and say, well, the introduction was good, the body, the development, the conclusion, the form, everything was good, but it is an average preaching. And then the professor said, please do not go and tell people, the people will stone at you, because this preacher is highly exclaimed by the people.
Right.
Because he touches the heart of the people, he connects. Of course, he may have used all the form, all the theology, but he speaks the language that is understood by the people.
Yeah, as beautifully said, conversion matters. I totally agree, and I thought Archbishop Tobin said that so well yesterday, that it's encounter Christ that matters. I, as someone who teaches theology, just want to sort of offer the side point of that, which is you can have your heart totally converted and have no form. And my fear is that we do have some priests who have a total converted heart to Christ, but don't know how to communicate. And I'm very Thomistic on this. Grace perfects nature. And if there's no nature to perfect, even if the heart is changed, you're not great. One of my great friends in the Department of Theology has said to me a number of times that he's not a naturally charismatic teacher. He's smart, he's brilliant, but he says he has no charisma as a teacher. So he learns that he has to actually use technique to make up for his lack of charisma. And he is one of the best teachers I've ever encountered. Much better than me, who sometimes operates solely out of charisma. He's way better than me. So I think that's right, and I want to keep that point sort of like in preaching, technique, you don't want technique to become, like any artist, you don't want the technique to become an idol. But I also want technique as someone who has to listen, so that I can encounter Christ. So yeah, I actually affirm it to the utmost degree, and thank you for bringing up that point.
I want to repeat what the first person said back there. I would encourage you to not taught this class at all, I think it's brilliant. Not only because I agree that it will help to ultimately improve the quality of preaching, but it's a very sneaky way of getting your young people to come to conscious faith through the process. And of course, from the point of view of the preacher, they'll actually be listening.
Yeah, I like sneaky ways.
Keep at it.
Yes?
I notice you don't have any women in your bibliography.
Yeah, so here's one of the things that I ran into with that. So I tried to add a number of women, but they're incredibly difficult to read. So Hildegard is exceptionally beautiful if you know how to read her, but it takes a real act of a real amount of learning to read her beautifully. And I'm always afraid they'll be turned off by Hildegard, so I've never done it.
There's
So-
some marvelous modern women.
Well, that's right, yeah.
So-
No, I think that's right, and I would if I was teaching this differently, but this is like, I show them videos of preachers, but I somewhat have to follow certain traditional theological figures down the line, and this is where the class suffers the most, is the absence of radically clear sermons from women before the year 20, or before the 20th century.
Well, you have some Protestant preachers in here, so you could go with somebody like Barbara Brown Taylor, who's one of the greatest
Sure,
living, and Episcopalian, so she's not a problem.
sure. Well, yeah. No, the Protestants aren't a problem. Yeah, no, if you have recommendations, I'd appreciate it. Because,
Exactly.
one of the things that I have to follow is that they're also sort of preaching on, the problem with this course is that it has to be following along a doctrinal line of thought, too. That's part of
Oh,
the
she's
course.
Catholic.
What's that?
She's just Catholic.
Oh, no, not that, but the preaching, it's like
Of course, you could read it.
milestones in theological thought. That's one of the things that the course has to do as well. So I have always thought about adapting it for audiences where I'm not as beholden to the kind of course I have to develop. To me, it's like that's actually why I assign them all to preach, because it's male and female voices that end up being heard in preaching. And they're all lay people, because they're 18. So none of them have been ordained yet. So, but for me, it is my one regret with the course continuing. So I will look that up and in the future add it. All right, well, you're done, and so thank you for spending time with me. A conference like this can be dispiriting, and I just want to thank you for your work. You're here, and it's with extreme. Whenever I get to speak to people who preach, I'm extremely grateful that you come and listen to me, who is not a preacher. So I'm very grateful for you, and I find your work to do gift. So thank you.